Chapter 1. Introduction to the Book of Jubilees and Genesis. The Bible is filled with stories that help us understand God's plan for the world and His people. Two of the most important books in the Bible are Genesis and the Book of Jubilees. While Genesis is part of the Standard Bible, the Book of Jubilees is considered an ancient Jewish text that is not included in most Christian Bibles. Despite this, it provides important details that can help us understand the Bible better. In this chapter, we will compare these two books, looking at their similarities and differences, and explore why both are significant in the study of God's Word. Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and it sets the foundation for everything that follows. It begins with the creation of the world and ends with the story of Joseph and his brothers in Egypt. In Genesis, we learn about the first people, Adam and Eve, and how sin entered the world. We also read about God's covenant with Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and how He promised to make them the father of a great nation. Genesis helps us understand the beginnings of the world, humanity, and God's plan for salvation. The Book of Jubilees, sometimes called the Lesser Genesis, is an ancient Jewish text that retells much of the same history as Genesis, but with some important differences. It covers many of the same stories, like creation, the fall of man, and the lives of the patriarchs, but includes additional details and focuses more on the laws and the covenant that God made with His people. The Book of Jubilees is structured around the idea of jubilees, which are 50-year periods, and it emphasizes God's plan unfolding over time through these cycles. While Genesis gives us a broad overview of the creation of the world and the early history of humanity, the Book of Jubilees goes into more detail, especially about the laws God gave to His people. This includes things like how to observe the Sabbath, how to keep the covenant, and how to follow God's commands. The Book of Jubilees also gives us extra information about the lives of the patriarchs and the events surrounding their lives. It provides a clearer picture of the people who came before Israel and how they shaped the nation. The Book of Jubilees and Genesis are both concerned with the idea of God's covenant with His people, but they present this idea in different ways. Genesis gives us the basic story of how God made promises to people like Abraham and Noah, but Jubilees takes these stories and adds more details. It shows how God's laws were meant to guide His people and help them live according to His will. It is a book that shows how God's plan was always unfolding and how important it was for people to obey His commands. One of the main differences between Genesis and Jubilees is the way they handle time. Genesis tells the story of the world in a more straightforward way, with events happening in a simple timeline. The Book of Jubilees, on the other hand, organizes history into periods called Jubilees. Each Jubilee represents a 50-year period, and the book divides history into several of these periods. This structure emphasizes the idea that God's plan unfolds in cycles, and each cycle is important in its own right. The Book of Jubilees shows us that history is not random, but has a purpose, and God is working in every moment to bring about His plan. Another difference between Genesis and Jubilees is the way they treat certain events and figures. For example, in the story of creation, both Genesis and Jubilees describe the creation of the world in a similar way, but the Book of Jubilees adds more details, such as naming the specific days that things were created. Jubilees also adds a focus on the angels and their role in creation, which is not emphasized in Genesis. In the story of Adam and Eve, both Genesis and Jubilees describe the fall of man, but Jubilees offers a more detailed account of Eve's role and the consequences for both Adam and Eve. The Book of Jubilees also includes more information about the lives of the patriarchs, such as Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. While Genesis gives us the main details of their lives, Jubilees offers additional stories and focuses more on the laws that God gave to them. For example, Jubilees emphasizes how Noah observed the laws of God, even before they were formally given to the people of Israel. It shows how Noah and his family were righteous and how they followed God's commands, even when others did not. The Book of Jubilees also gives us more details about the covenant God made with Abraham. Genesis tells us that God promised Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation, but Jubilees adds more specifics about how Abraham followed God's instructions and how he passed down these teachings to his children. Jubilees shows us that God's covenant with Abraham was not just about making promises, but about living according to God's laws and teaching them to future generations. One thing that both Genesis and Jubilees share is the importance of God's law. In Genesis, we see how God gave commandments to his people, starting with Adam and Eve. For example, God told Adam not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Genesis 2 verses 16 to 17. And this law was broken when Eve and Adam ate the forbidden fruit. Later, in the story of Noah, God gave Noah specific instructions on how to build the ark, Genesis 6 verses 14 to 16, and Noah obeyed these commands. The Book of Jubilees builds on this idea by showing how God's law was not just for the patriarchs but for all of his people. It emphasizes the importance of observing God's commandments, especially the Sabbath, and how these laws were meant to guide the people of Israel throughout their history. Despite these differences, the Book of Jubilees and Genesis both emphasize God's covenant and his desire for his people to live according to his will. Genesis tells the story of God's relationship with humanity, starting with Adam and Eve, and continues with the promises made to Noah, Abraham, and others. Jubilees takes these stories and adds more depth, showing how God's law was given to his people to guide them on their journey. Both books highlight the importance of obedience to God and the consequences of disobedience. So, how do we understand these two books together? Genesis gives us the foundational stories of creation, the fall of man, and the patriarchs. It is the story of how God created the world and began his plan for salvation. The Book of Jubilees, while not part of the standard Christian Bible, provides additional details and focuses more on the role of the law in God's plan. It offers a deeper understanding of the covenant and shows how God's commands were meant to guide his people. Reading both books together can give us a fuller picture of God's plan and how he has always been at work in history. Genesis introduces us to the key figures and events that shape the history of Israel, while Jubilees adds details that help us understand God's law and his desire for his people to follow it. In both books, we see God's faithfulness and his desire for his people to live holy lives. In conclusion, the Book of Jubilees and Genesis are closely related but offer different perspectives on God's plan for the world. Genesis tells the story of creation, the fall of man, and the patriarchs, while the Book of Jubilees expands on these stories by providing additional details and focusing on the law and the covenant. Both books help us understand God's plan for salvation and the importance of living according to his will. While Genesis is part of the Christian Bible, the Book of Jubilees is an important text that can offer valuable insights into the deeper meaning of the stories we find in Genesis. Understanding both books can help us grow in our knowledge of God's Word and deepen our understanding of his eternal plan. Chapter 2. Creation Story, Genesis versus Jubilees. The creation story is one of the most important parts of the Bible. It tells us how God created the world, everything in it, and humanity itself. The Book of Genesis and the Book of Jubilees both share the same basic story of creation, but they tell it in different ways. Understanding both can help us see the different perspectives and details in these two books. Let's look at how both Genesis and Jubilees tell the story of creation and what that means for us today. In the first chapter of Genesis, we read about how God created the heavens and the earth. The Bible says that in the beginning, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Then God's Spirit moved over the waters. The first thing God did was speak. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. This is how the creation of light began. In Genesis, God spoke everything into existence. He created the sky, the land, the sea, the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the creatures that live on earth. Every day, God made something new, and when he finished each day of creation, he saw that it was good. In Genesis 1, we are told that God created everything in 6 days. On the first day, he created light. On the second day, he created the sky. On the third day, he gathered the waters together and made dry land. And then he created plants. On the fourth day, God created the sun, the moon, and the stars to give light to the earth. On the fifth day, he created the creatures in the waters and the birds in the sky. On the sixth day, he created the animals on the land, and finally, he created man. The Bible says that God created man in his own image. Male and female, he created them. On the seventh day, God rested from his work, which he had finished, and he blessed that day, making it holy. The Book of Jubilees, although it shares many similarities with Genesis, offers some additional details about the creation story. Like Genesis, it begins with the creation of the heavens and the earth, but it provides more specific information about the days of creation. The Book of Jubilees follows the same basic pattern, with God creating light, the sky, the land, the sun, the moon, and the stars, but it also emphasizes the importance of the Sabbath from the beginning. In the Book of Jubilees, we are told that on the first day of creation, God made the light and divided it from the darkness. But the text goes further to say that God called the light day and the darkness night. This is very similar to what we see in Genesis, but Jubilees highlights the fact that from the very first day, the idea of day and night was established. The Book of Jubilees also emphasizes the role of the angels in creation. In this version, the angels are involved in helping God carry out his work. The Book of Jubilees gives more attention to the heavenly beings and their role in creation, something that is not as clearly explained in Genesis. On the second day, God created the sky in both Genesis and Jubilees. However, the Book of Jubilees adds more detail by mentioning that God created the waters and divided them. The waters above were separated from the waters below, and this division created the sky. The story is similar in both texts, but Jubilees places more focus on how God's creation was organized and ordered. On the third day, Genesis tells us that God gathered the waters together and allowed dry land to appear. He also created plants and trees to grow on the land. The Book of Jubilees, however, adds that the plants were created for the purpose of providing food for man, which is something not mentioned in Genesis. Jubilees also emphasizes that God made the earth to be fruitful and to bring forth all kinds of vegetation, reinforcing the idea that everything God made was meant to be good for his creation. The fourth day of creation is similar in both Genesis and Jubilees. In Genesis, God created the sun, the moon, and the stars to give light to the earth, to separate day from night, and to mark the seasons, days, and years. The Book of Jubilees also mentions the creation of these heavenly bodies, but it goes further to say that the sun and the moon were made to rule over the day and the night. The moon was given its own specific role in governing the night, and the sun was given the day. This added focus on the roles of the sun and moon highlights the importance of the natural world in both Genesis and Jubilees. On the fifth day, both Genesis and Jubilees describe the creation of the creatures in the sea and the birds in the sky. In Genesis, God made the sea creatures and the birds and blessed them, telling them to be fruitful and multiply. In Jubilees, the same creatures are created, but the text adds that they were given a specific role in the world, just as the other creatures were given their roles. Jubilees also stresses that God created everything in its proper order, with each creature filling a purpose in his creation. On the sixth day, both Genesis and Jubilees describe how God created the animals on the earth, and then, at the end of the day, he created man. Genesis tells us that God created man in his image, and he gave man dominion over the animals, telling him to be fruitful and multiply, and to fill the earth. The Book of Jubilees agrees with this idea, but adds that man was given specific responsibilities. It says that man was given the responsibility to keep the commandments and to observe the laws that God had established, even before the formal giving of the law to Moses. This focus on the role of man in keeping God's commands is one of the key differences in Jubilees compared to Genesis. In both Genesis and Jubilees, God rests on the seventh day, and this day is set apart as a holy day of rest. Genesis tells us that God sanctified the seventh day and made it holy, which became the foundation for the Sabbath. The Book of Jubilees also mentions the Sabbath and emphasizes the importance of observing it. Jubilees expands on the idea of the Sabbath by emphasizing that it was not just a day of rest, but a day to honor God and His creation. This idea is central in both texts, but Jubilees adds a sense of deeper spiritual significance to the Sabbath rest. One of the key differences between Genesis and Jubilees in the creation story is the focus on time and structure. While Genesis presents the creation story as a simple, linear account of the days of creation, the Book of Jubilees organizes time into cycles of 49 years, or Jubilees, and each cycle has its own significance. Jubilees is more concerned with showing how God's creation unfolds over time, with a specific focus on how God's plan is being revealed. This structure of time highlights the idea that God's work is not just a one-time event, but part of an ongoing plan that spans many generations. Another difference between the two books is their treatment of angels and their role in creation. Genesis does not mention angels in the creation account, but the Book of Jubilees adds that angels were involved in helping God carry out His work. These angels are seen as assisting God in bringing order to the world and carrying out His commands, which adds a layer of understanding about the heavenly realm that Genesis does not explore in detail. Both Genesis and Jubilees agree on the essential truths about creation: that God is the creator, that He created the world in an orderly fashion, and that everything He made was good. Both texts show the importance of humanity being created in the image of God and given a special role in creation. However, the Book of Jubilees offers additional details that give us a deeper understanding of how creation works in the plan of God, especially in relation to time, the Sabbath, and the role of angels. In conclusion, the creation story in Genesis and the Book of Jubilees shares many similarities, but there are also significant differences. Genesis gives us a clear and straightforward account of how God created the world, and Jubilees builds on this by offering more details, focusing on the role of time, angels, and the importance of following God's commands. Both books teach us that God is the creator and that He made the world with a purpose. By studying both texts, we can gain a richer understanding of how God created the world and what He desires for us as His creation. Chapter 3. The Fall of Man, Genesis versus Jubilees. The story of the fall of man is a pivotal moment in the Bible. It explains how sin entered the world and affected all of creation. Both the Book of Genesis and the Book of Jubilees share the same basic account of the fall, but they offer some differences in details and emphasis. Understanding how these two books tell the story helps us see both the similarities and differences in their teachings. In Genesis, the fall of man happens in the Garden of Eden. God had created a perfect world, and in the garden, He placed Adam and Eve. They were given everything they needed to live, and they were given one command: not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God told them that if they ate from it, they would surely die. This command was clear, and there was no confusion about what was expected of them. They were to trust God and obey His command. However, in Genesis, we see that the serpent, which was more subtle than any beast of the field, entered the scene. The serpent spoke to Eve and asked, "Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden?" Genesis 3 verse 1. Eve replied that they could eat from all the trees, except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God had commanded them not to eat from. The serpent then told Eve that they would not die if they ate the fruit, but instead, their eyes would be opened, and they would become like God, knowing good and evil. Eve was tempted, and she saw that the tree was good for food, pleasant to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. So she took the fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, Adam, and he ate as well. Immediately, their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were naked. They became ashamed and sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. When they heard the voice of God walking in the garden, they hid themselves because they were afraid. God called out to Adam and asked, "Where art thou?" Adam replied that he was hiding because he was naked. God asked, "Who told thee that thou wast naked?" Genesis 3 verse 11. Adam admitted that he had eaten from the tree. When God questioned Eve, she confessed that she had been deceived by the serpent. God then pronounced judgment on the serpent, Eve, and Adam. The serpent was cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust. Eve was told that she would experience pain in childbirth and that her desire would be for her husband, but he would rule over her. Adam was told that the ground would be cursed because of him, and he would have to work hard to produce food from it. Finally, God banished Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, placing cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life. The Book of Jubilees offers a similar account of the fall of man, but with some additional details and a slightly different emphasis. Jubilees follows the same basic story. Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. They are given a command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they are tempted by the serpent. However, in Jubilees, we see more emphasis on the role of the angels in the story. Jubilees tells us that the angels were watching over Adam and Eve in the garden, and that they warned them not to disobey God's command. The angels even told Adam that the serpent was going to tempt him. However, Adam and Eve chose to ignore the warning and ate the fruit anyway. In Jubilees, the serpent is described as more of a direct instrument of Satan. The book goes further to explain that Satan, through the serpent, led Eve to disobey God. Jubilees emphasizes that Satan was not simply a tempter, but a force actively working to bring about the fall of humanity. This detail is not as clear in Genesis, where the serpent is presented more as a deceiver than as the direct work of Satan. In both texts, the serpent's role is central, but Jubilees underscores the idea that Satan was the force behind the temptation. When Eve ate the fruit and gave it to Adam, they both immediately became aware of their nakedness, just as in Genesis. However, in Jubilees, there is more focus on the idea that Adam and Eve were living in innocence before their fall, and the fall led them to a deeper awareness of their sin. They felt ashamed of their nakedness and their sin against God. Jubilees also describes how Adam and Eve tried to cover themselves, just as in Genesis, but they were still aware of their guilt and the punishment that would follow. One key difference in Jubilees is that after Adam and Eve sinned, they were immediately punished, but the judgment is more detailed. Jubilees emphasizes that Adam and Eve's sin led to the fall of all their descendants. It states that because of Adam's disobedience, death entered the world, and the world itself became cursed. The book also highlights that Adam's disobedience caused a separation between humanity and God, as Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden. While Genesis also mentions the consequences of sin, Jubilees elaborates on how Adam's sin affected future generations, setting the stage for the story of redemption. In Genesis, God gives Adam and Eve the opportunity to confess their sin and accept the consequences, but there is no explicit mention of their repentance. In Jubilees, however, there is a sense that Adam and Eve's actions were part of a larger plan that would unfold over time. This is hinted at in Jubilees, where it is mentioned that the judgment on Adam and Eve would last for 10 generations, but there would eventually be a hope of redemption. This idea of a long-term plan for redemption is more developed in Jubilees than in Genesis, where the focus is more on the immediate consequences of the fall. Both Genesis and Jubilees agree that the fall had a profound effect on the world. In Genesis, the curse on the ground, the pain in childbirth, and the banishment from the Garden of Eden are all part of the consequences of Adam and Eve's disobedience. These consequences are seen as a direct result of their sin. The ground is cursed, and Adam must work hard to produce food. Eve's pain in childbirth is a reminder of the consequences of sin. The banishment from the garden is a symbol of humanity's separation from God because of sin. In Jubilees, the consequences are similar but are explained in a way that emphasizes the long-lasting effects of the fall. The book stresses that Adam's sin not only affected him and Eve, but also had an impact on their descendants. The entire world was affected by the fall, and the curse of sin spread to all of humanity. Jubilees also highlights that the fallenness of mankind was not an accident, but part of a larger divine plan. The book hints that God's plan of redemption would eventually come through the descendants of Adam and Eve, culminating in the coming of a Savior who would undo the effects of the fall. Another key difference between Genesis and Jubilees is their treatment of the serpent. In Genesis, the the serpent is cursed by God, but the focus is mainly on its physical consequences, like crawling on its belly and eating dust. In Jubilees, the serpent is seen as a direct instrument of Satan, and the curse is more deeply connected to the spiritual battle between good and evil. Jubilees makes it clear that the serpent, under the influence of Satan, was the agent of evil that led Adam and Eve into sin, and the consequences of that sin would echo. In conclusion, the fall of man is a foundational event in both Genesis and Jubilees. Both books agree that Adam and Eve were created in innocence, but they disobeyed God by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This act of disobedience brought sin and death into the world and had consequences for all of creation. While Genesis presents a more straightforward account of the fall, the Book of Jubilees offers additional details that highlight the role of angels, the influence of Satan, and the long-term effects of Adam and Eve's sin on their descendants. Together, these two accounts help us understand the seriousness of the fall and its consequences, as well as the hope of redemption that would one day come. Chapter 4. The Patriarchs, Genesis versus Jubilees. The stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are central to both the Book of Genesis and the Book of Jubilees. These figures play important roles in the history of Israel and are foundational to the Christian faith. While both Genesis and Jubilees tell the stories of these patriarchs, there are some key similarities and differences between the two books. The Book of Genesis, being part of the Bible's accepted canon, is familiar to most Christians, but the Book of Jubilees offers additional details and emphasizes certain themes in a way that differs slightly from the Genesis account. In Genesis, we first meet Abraham, the father of the faith. God calls him out of Ur of the Chaldees, telling him to leave his country and kindred and go to a land that God would show him. Abraham is promised that he will become the father of a great nation. Genesis 12 verses 1 to 3 records the call of Abraham, where God promises to bless him and make his name great. Abraham is obedient and follows God's instructions, even though he doesn't know exactly where he is going. Abraham's faith is tested when God asks him to sacrifice his son Isaac, and Abraham obeys without hesitation. This act of obedience is one of the most famous moments in the Genesis narrative, and it shows Abraham's unwavering trust in God. In the Book of Jubilees, the story of Abraham is similar, but there are some additional details. One notable difference is the emphasis on Abraham's early life. Jubilees expands on the account of Abraham's upbringing, stating that he was a righteous man who rejected the idolatry of his father, Terah. According to Jubilees 11:14, Abraham recognized that the idols his father worshipped were false, and he refused to worship them. This detail is not found in Genesis, where Abraham's early life is not as extensively discussed. In Genesis, we learn that Abraham's call came after he had already left Ur, but in Jubilees, we see a clearer picture of Abraham's early rejection of idolatry. Jubilees also emphasizes that Abraham's faith was not only tested with the command to sacrifice Isaac, but that God also tested him in many other ways. In Jubilees 16:16-18, it is mentioned that Abraham was tested multiple times by God before the command to sacrifice Isaac. This includes the testing of his faith in leaving his home, his dealings with Pharaoh, and his patience with God's promises. The idea that Abraham faced multiple tests is more explicit in Jubilees than in Genesis, where we see a few key moments but no specific mention of multiple trials. Isaac, the promised son of Abraham and Sarah, is the next patriarch in both books. In Genesis, Isaac's birth is miraculous, as Sarah, his mother, was barren. God promises Abraham that he will have a son, and despite their old age, Isaac is born. The story of Isaac's life focuses on his marriage to Rebekah, the birth of his two sons, Esau and Jacob, and the passing on of the covenant blessings. Isaac's life, while important, does not have as much detail as Abraham's. But Genesis makes clear that Isaac is the son through whom God's promises will continue. In Jubilees, Isaac's story is similar but with more emphasis on his birth. Jubilees 19:1-9 provides additional details about Sarah's grief and joy upon learning that she would bear a son, and it highlights Isaac's role as the child of promise. Jubilees also includes a more detailed account of Isaac's life, his marriage to Rebekah, and the birth of his sons, Esau and Jacob. One interesting addition in Jubilees is the mention that Isaac was aware of God's covenant with his father Abraham and that Isaac took part in the covenant ceremony with Abraham. This detail, which is not in Genesis, helps to show Isaac's awareness of his place in God's plan. Isaac's relationship with his sons, Esau and Jacob, is a key theme in both Genesis and Jubilees. In Genesis, Esau and Jacob have a troubled relationship, with Jacob deceiving his father Isaac to receive the blessing meant for Esau. The rivalry between the brothers is highlighted throughout Genesis, and it culminates in Jacob fleeing to his mother's family to escape Esau's wrath. Genesis 25 verses 29 to 34 recounts the story of Jacob tricking Esau into selling his birthright for a bowl of stew, and Genesis 27 describes how Jacob deceives his blind father to receive Esau's blessing. In the Book of Jubilees, the story of Esau and Jacob is told with some differences. Jubilees 25:1-15 elaborates on the rivalry between the brothers, particularly emphasizing Esau's disregard for his birthright and his impulsive nature. The story of Esau selling his birthright is similar in both books, but Jubilees adds that Esau did not value the covenant and was more concerned with satisfying his fleshly desires. Jubilees also adds that Isaac and Rebekah were aware of Jacob's future role in God's plan, and they knew that Jacob was chosen to carry on the blessing. This sense of divine election is more emphasized in Jubilees than in Genesis, where the focus is more on the deception and family drama surrounding the birthright. Jacob, the third patriarch, is a key figure in both Genesis and Jubilees. In Genesis, Jacob is the son who receives the blessing and the covenant promises that were intended for Esau. His life is marked by both struggles and blessings. After deceiving his father, Jacob runs away to his uncle Laban's house, where he marries Leah and Rachel. Jacob's 12 sons, including Joseph, become the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's life is filled with moments of both faith and struggle, and his relationship with God is central to the Genesis narrative. In Jubilees, Jacob's life is similarly detailed, but with additional emphasis on his relationship with God. Jubilees 32:1-13 highlights Jacob's experiences and his faith in God, particularly his wrestling with the angel at Peniel. In Genesis 32 verses 24-30, Jacob wrestles with a man who is later revealed to be an angel or God himself. The story ends with Jacob receiving the name Israel. In Jubilees, this event is given more attention, and the spiritual significance of the name change is emphasized. The book also adds that Jacob's faith was tested when he had to leave Laban's household and return to the land of Canaan. Jubilees emphasizes Jacob's devotion to God throughout his life, showing him as a man who continually sought God's guidance. Another key difference between Genesis and Jubilees is how the two books treat the 12 tribes of Israel. In Genesis, the focus is on the birth of Jacob's sons and the significance of Joseph, who is sold into slavery by his brothers but later becomes a ruler in Egypt. The story of Joseph is central to the Genesis narrative, and his reconciliation with his brothers is a pivotal moment in the book. However, Jubilees goes further in emphasizing the role of each of the 12 tribes, detailing the spiritual legacy and importance of each tribe. Jubilees offers additional stories and teachings about the 12 tribes that are not found in Genesis, highlighting their roles in God's plan for Israel. In conclusion, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are central figures in both Genesis and Jubilees. While both books share many of the same stories, Jubilees offers additional details and emphasizes certain themes more than Genesis. For example, Jubilees focuses on the early life of Abraham, his rejection of idolatry, and his multiple tests of faith. The stories of Isaac and Jacob are similar in both books, but Jubilees provides a more detailed account of Isaac's awareness of God's covenant and Jacob's faith. Jubilees also emphasizes the spiritual significance of the 12 tribes of Israel and their role in God's plan for redemption. Both Genesis and Jubilees teach us about God's faithfulness to his promises, the importance of faith, and the continuing story of redemption through the patriarchs. Chapter 5. The Covenant, Genesis versus Jubilees. The covenant is a foundational theme in the Bible, especially when it comes to God's promises to his people. Both the Book of Genesis and the Book of Jubilees discuss the covenant that God made with his people, but each book approaches it in slightly different ways. Genesis is the first book of the Bible and lays the groundwork for the relationship between God and humanity, while Jubilees, an ancient Jewish text, provides additional details that shed more light on this covenant and the way it unfolds throughout history. In Genesis, the covenant is introduced with God's promise to Noah after the flood. Genesis 9 verses 11 to 17 records God's promise to never again destroy the earth with a flood. This covenant is symbolized by the rainbow, which serves as a reminder of God's promise to Noah and his descendants. God tells Noah that he will never again bring a flood to destroy the earth, and the rainbow is given as a sign of this enduring promise. This covenant is not just for Noah, but for all future generations, showing God's desire to establish a relationship with humanity. The covenant with Noah in Genesis marks the beginning of God's promise to his people. After the flood, God also promises that the earth will continue to be fruitful and that human beings will continue to multiply and fill the earth. This covenant is unconditional. It is not based on the actions of humanity, but on God's decision to show mercy. It is important to note that this covenant does not require any specific actions or sacrifices from Noah or his descendants. It is simply a promise that God makes to them. The next significant covenant in Genesis is the one God makes with Abraham. Genesis 12 verses 1 to 3 records God's call to Abraham, where he promises to make him a great nation. God tells Abraham that he will bless him, make his name great, and that all the families of the earth will be blessed through him. This is the beginning of God's covenant with Abraham, a covenant that is built on faith and obedience. God promises to give Abraham a land, a people, and blessings that will extend to all nations. In Genesis 15 verses 18 to 21, God formalizes this covenant with Abraham, making a specific promise about the land that his descendants will inherit. The covenant is further confirmed when God changes Abram's name to Abraham, signifying the new relationship between them. One key element of the Abrahamic covenant is that it is based on faith. In Genesis 15 verse 6, we are told that Abraham believed God, and this faith was counted to him as righteousness. God promises Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that through him, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. This promise is unconditional, and it is fulfilled through the birth of Isaac, the son of promise, and later through the nation of Israel. In Genesis 17, God makes a more specific promise to Abraham, commanding him and his descendants to keep the covenant through circumcision. This is a sign of the covenant that sets apart Abraham's descendants as God's chosen people. The covenant is not just a promise to Abraham, but to his descendants as well. Genesis 17 verses 7 to 8 highlights that this covenant is meant to last forever, with God being the God of Abraham and his descendants for all generations. The covenant is a lasting relationship, one that requires faith and obedience from Abraham and his descendants. While the covenant with Abraham is important in Genesis, it is also significant in the Book of Jubilees. In Jubilees 13:1-18, the covenant with Abraham is reiterated and expanded upon. One key difference between Genesis and Jubilees is the emphasis that Jubilees places on the timing and the significance of God's promises to Abraham. In Jubilees, it is clear that the covenant is not just a promise to Abraham, but to his descendants after him. In this book, we see a more detailed account of Abraham's obedience to God's command to circumcise himself and his household. This covenant, like in Genesis, is centered around Abraham's faith and obedience to God's commands. But Jubilees emphasizes the importance of keeping the covenant through specific acts of obedience. In Jubilees, the covenant with Abraham is not only about the physical promise of land and descendants, but also about the spiritual aspect of maintaining a relationship with God. Jubilees 15:1-34 expands on the idea that the covenant is a lifelong commitment, one that Abraham and his descendants must uphold through righteousness and faithfulness. The book stresses that God's covenant is not just about material blessings, but also about living a holy life according to God's commandments. This focus on the spiritual aspects of the covenant is more pronounced in Jubilees than in Genesis, where the physical and material blessings take center stage. Another important aspect of the covenant in Genesis is the promise that God will bless those who bless Abraham and curse those who curse him. Genesis 12 verse 3 and Genesis 18 verses 18 to 19 highlight this promise, showing that God's blessing extends not just to Abraham, but to those who align themselves with him. The covenant in Genesis is not just a personal promise to Abraham. It is also a promise for those who share in the faith and the worship of the one true God. This idea is reiterated throughout the book, with God's covenant extending to all who follow him. In Jubilees, the theme of blessing and cursing is also present, but it is made even clearer that those who break the covenant will face consequences. In Jubilees 15:16-25, we see that those who violate the covenant will be punished, emphasizing that the covenant requires more than just belief. It requires obedience to God's commands. This aspect of the covenant is less emphasized in Genesis, where the focus is more on God's grace and promises rather than the consequences of disobedience. In Jubilees, the covenant is presented as a two-way relationship. God promises blessings to those who are faithful, but there are also curses for those who fail to uphold their part of the covenant. The covenant in Genesis is also closely tied to the promise of the coming Messiah. In Genesis 3 verse 15, after the fall of man, God promises that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. This is the first hint of the gospel message and the coming of Jesus Christ, who will ultimately fulfill the promise made to Abraham. The covenant with Abraham is seen as a part of this larger plan of redemption, where through Abraham's descendants, the Messiah will come. Genesis 22 verse 18 also points to this promise, where God tells Abraham that through his seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, pointing to Jesus Christ. In Jubilees, the coming of the Messiah is also anticipated. Jubilees 23:18-32 speaks of the coming of a righteous one who will deliver Israel, echoing the messianic promises found in Genesis. The book stresses that the covenant is ultimately about God's plan of salvation, which will be fulfilled through the coming of a Savior. This theme of the coming Messiah is central to the covenant in both Genesis and Jubilees, showing that the covenant is not just about earthly blessings, but about God's eternal plan to redeem humanity. The covenant in both Genesis and Jubilees is ultimately a promise of God's faithfulness to his people. In both books, God promises to bless his people and to be their God, and this promise is extended to future generations. The covenant is a central theme that highlights God's desire to have a relationship with his people and to bless them in every way. While the two books present the covenant in slightly different ways, they both emphasize the importance of faith, obedience, and God's promises. In conclusion, the covenant in Genesis and Jubilees is central to the biblical narrative. Both books highlight God's promises to his people, and while they differ in their focus and details, they both emphasize the need for faithfulness and obedience to God's commands. The covenant with Noah, Abraham, and their descendants is a key element of the biblical story, one that points forward to the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises through Jesus Christ. Whether in Genesis or Jubilees, the covenant remains a testament to God's enduring faithfulness and his desire to bless his people. Chapter 6. The Law, Genesis versus Jubilees. The law plays an essential role in the Bible, especially in guiding God's people on how to live in a way that is pleasing to him. Both Genesis and Jubilees touch on aspects of God's law, but each book emphasizes it differently. Genesis, the first book of the Bible, introduces the basic principles of God's expectations, while Jubilees, an ancient Jewish text, provides more specific teachings and highlights the importance of following God's law throughout history. In Genesis, the first mention of God's law is found in the story of Adam and Eve. In Genesis 2 verses 16-17, God gives Adam a command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is the first example of God giving a law to his people. The law is clear and simple. Do not eat from the tree. God gives Adam the freedom to eat from every other tree in the garden, but this one tree is off limits. This is an early example of God's moral law, showing that he has authority over his creation and that his commands are to be followed. Sadly, Adam and Eve disobey God's law, which leads to the fall of humanity and the introduction of sin into the world. This disobedience highlights the importance of following God's laws and the consequences of failing to do so. In Genesis, the law is often associated with God's relationship with his people. After the fall, God continues to guide humanity by giving them rules to follow. For example, in Genesis 4 verses 3 to 16, God gives Cain a warning about sin. Cain's jealousy and anger lead him to kill his brother Abel, but God warns him in verse 7, saying, "If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door." This shows that God's law is not just about rules, but also about understanding the consequences of sin. Even before the formal giving of the law to Moses, God is already warning his people about the need to make righteous choices. When we move to the story of Noah, we see that God's law continues to guide humanity, even in the midst of widespread corruption. In Genesis 6 verses 5 to 7, the Bible tells us that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and God decided to destroy mankind because of their evil ways. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. In Genesis 6 verse 9, Noah is described as a just man, perfect in his generations. This is not to say Noah was without sin, but it does show that he sought to live by God's guidance and followed the law as best he could. God gave Noah instructions to build the ark, and Noah obeyed them, demonstrating the importance of following God's commands even in difficult circumstances. After the flood, in Genesis 9 verses 1 to 17, God gives Noah and his descendants the covenant of the rainbow, and the law continues to play a significant role in guiding them. The story of Abraham also brings attention to God's law. In Genesis 17 verses 1 to 14, God gives Abraham the command to circumcise himself and all of his male descendants as a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham's family. Circumcision becomes an important law for the Israelites, showing that God requires outward signs of his covenant and obedience. The law is also a sign of belonging to God's people, and through this act, Abraham and his descendants demonstrate their obedience to God. This shows that the law is not just about following rules, but also about demonstrating one's commitment to God and his promises. While Genesis introduces the concept of God's law, the Book of Jubilees provides much more detail on the laws God gave to his people, particularly with regard to the covenant made with Abraham and the later laws that would come through Moses. Jubilees 6:1-38 expands on the importance of circumcision, emphasizing its role in maintaining the covenant between God and his people. The book stresses that circumcision is not just an act of obedience, but a sign of the eternal covenant, meant to be passed down from generation to generation. In this way, the law in Jubilees is treated as a vital and continuous tradition that should be upheld by future generations. Jubilees also expands on the role of the law in the lives of God's people by detailing the moral and ceremonial laws that would govern Israel. In Jubilees 1-1-4, God tells Moses that his law is to be kept by his people throughout all generations. This emphasizes that God's laws are not temporary but eternal, and they are to be followed by his people forever. The book highlights the importance of keeping God's commandments and remaining faithful to his laws. Jubilees 7:20-30 even goes so far as to explain the specific observances of the feasts and holy days that were required under the law. This shows how important it is to honor God's commandments and celebrate the feasts that he established as a way of reminding his people of his faithfulness. One of the significant differences between Genesis and Jubilees is the way the law is portrayed as a way of maintaining holiness. In Genesis, the law is often seen as a general set of principles that guide God's people. But in Jubilees, there is a much more detailed focus on the specific rules and laws that God expects his people to follow. Jubilees 2:9-14 emphasizes the importance of keeping the law in a very specific and organized manner, stressing that every detail must be followed to maintain the purity and holiness of God's people. The law is not just something to be remembered, but something to be actively practiced and obeyed. In addition to the moral and ceremonial laws, Jubilees also provides guidance on how to live a life that pleases God. Jubilees 23:12-18 discusses the importance of not taking part in the corrupt practices of the nations around Israel. It stresses that God's people are to remain separate and distinct from the other nations by following His law. This is similar to how God instructs His people in Genesis to avoid intermarrying with the descendants of the ungodly. The law is seen as a way of maintaining a pure relationship with God and avoiding the dangers of idolatry and sin. This is a recurring theme throughout Jubilees, showing that the law is not just a set of external rules, but a way to protect the heart and soul from corruption. Both Genesis and Jubilees highlight the importance of obedience to God's law, but they do so in different ways. Genesis focuses on the simple, foundational principles of God's law, showing how God gives His commands to His people and the consequences of disobedience. It introduces the idea that God's laws are tied to His covenant and are meant to guide His people in their relationship with Him. On the other hand, Jubilees takes a more detailed approach, providing specific instructions on how the law should be practiced and emphasizing the eternal nature of God's commandments. It stresses the need for careful and faithful observance of the law as a way of maintaining holiness. In conclusion, both Genesis and Jubilees teach that God's law is essential for His people. In Genesis, the law is presented as a foundational principle that sets the stage for the rest of the Bible. It shows how God's people are to live in a way that reflects His holiness, and it introduces the idea that disobedience to God's law leads to consequences. Jubilees builds on this foundation by providing more specific and detailed instructions on how to live according to God's law. It emphasizes that the law is not just about following rules, but about living a life that is faithful to God's covenant and maintaining holiness in every area of life. Together, these books help believers understand that God's law is an important part of the relationship between God and His people, and that obeying His law is essential for living a life that honors Him. Conclusion: the significance of both texts in biblical theology. The Book of Genesis and the Book of Jubilees hold significant places in the Bible and offer unique perspectives on the history of God's people and the laws He gave them. Genesis, as the first book of the Bible, introduces us to the beginning of creation, the fall of man, and the early covenants that God made with humanity. It is the foundation of biblical theology, setting the stage for everything that follows in the Bible. Jubilees, on the other hand, is an ancient text that expands upon the events recorded in Genesis. While it is not included in the traditional Jewish or Christian canon, it still provides important insights into how the early history of the world and the laws of God were understood in Jewish tradition. By comparing and contrasting both texts, we can gain a deeper understanding of their significance in biblical theology. Genesis, as the foundational book of the Bible, introduces the core themes of creation, sin, judgment, and redemption. It reveals God's sovereignty over the universe and His authority to set rules for His creation. Genesis 1 verse 1 begins with a powerful statement. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. This simple sentence lays the groundwork for everything that comes after. From the creation of the world to the formation of man and woman, Genesis teaches that God is the Creator and that everything in existence has been made according to His will. One of the central themes in Genesis is the relationship between God and humanity. In Genesis 2 verse 7, God forms man from the dust of the ground and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. This act shows that humans are special in God's eyes and are made in His image. The creation of Eve from Adam's rib further emphasizes the deep connection between man and woman, showing that they were made for each other and meant to live together in harmony. But despite their special creation, humanity's relationship with God is marred by sin. In Genesis 3, Adam and Eve disobey God's command by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This act of disobedience introduces sin into the world, and the consequences are far-reaching. Genesis 3 verses 16 to 19 outlines the curse that results from their sin, bringing pain, suffering, and death into the world. Genesis also introduces the concept of redemption. Even as God pronounces judgment on Adam and Eve, he promises a Savior. In Genesis 3 verse 15, God tells the serpent, "I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." This promise, often called the proto-evangelium, points forward to the coming of Jesus Christ, who would defeat Satan and offer redemption to humanity. This promise of redemption is a key theme in Genesis that sets the stage for the rest of the Bible. The Book of Jubilees builds on these themes by providing a more detailed account of the events recorded in Genesis. It retells the creation story, the fall of man, the patriarchs, and the covenant between God and his people. However, it also offers additional details and emphasizes the importance of following God's law. For example, in Jubilees 1:1-4, God speaks to Moses and tells him that he gave his law to his people from the beginning of creation, emphasizing the eternal nature of his commandments. Jubilees highlights the idea that the law is not just something that was given later in history, but something that has always been part of God's plan for his people. Jubilees also emphasizes the importance of the covenant between God and his people. In Jubilees 2:9-14, God commands that circumcision be practiced as a sign of the covenant, just as he had done in Genesis 17 with Abraham. This shows the ongoing importance of the covenant in God's relationship with his people. Jubilees further elaborates on the laws and customs that were given to God's people, emphasizing that these laws were meant to set them apart from the nations around them and help them live holy lives. The book highlights the idea that God's people are to live in obedience to his commands, and that the law is central to their identity as God's chosen people. In both Genesis and Jubilees, we see that God's law plays a crucial role in his relationship with his people. While Genesis introduces the law in its most basic form, as seen in the command given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Jubilees expands on this idea by providing more specific laws and explaining how they were to be followed by God's people. Genesis 26 verse 5 says, "Because that Abraham obeyed my voice, and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." This verse highlights that obedience to God's law was central to Abraham's faith and his relationship with God. Jubilees takes this idea further by emphasizing that obedience to God's law is not just an individual matter, but a communal one. God's people are to live together in harmony, following his laws and setting an example for the nations around them. Another important theme that is emphasized in both Genesis and Jubilees is the idea of God's faithfulness to his promises. In Genesis, we see that God makes covenants with key figures such as Noah, Abraham, and David, promising to bless their descendants and make them a great nation. Despite the failures of humanity, God remains faithful to his promises, and his covenant with his people is never broken. This faithfulness is echoed in Jubilees, where the covenant is seen as eternal and unbreakable. Jubilees 1:24-25 emphasizes that God's covenant with his people is meant to last forever, and that his law is a reflection of his unchanging character. In comparing Genesis and Jubilees, we can see how the two books complement each other and provide a fuller picture of God's plan for his people. Genesis lays the foundation for biblical theology, introducing key themes such as creation, sin, redemption, and God's covenant with his people. Jubilees builds on these themes, providing more detailed explanations of God's laws and the importance of following them. Both books emphasize the centrality of God's law in the lives of his people and highlight his faithfulness to his promises. The significance of these texts in biblical theology cannot be overstated. Genesis provides the foundational understanding of God's work in the world, and Jubilees deepens this understanding by offering further insights into the nature of God's covenant and law. For Christians, both Genesis and Jubilees point forward to the coming of Jesus Christ, the fulfillment of God's promise of redemption. In Genesis, we see the first promise of a Savior, and in Jubilees, we see the ongoing importance of living in obedience to God's commands as a way of preparing for the coming Messiah. In conclusion, Genesis and Jubilees both offer important insights into the nature of God's relationship with His people and the role of His law in that relationship. Genesis introduces the foundational themes of creation, sin, and redemption, while Jubilees expands on these themes by providing a more detailed understanding of God's law and its significance for His people. Together, these books offer a rich and comprehensive view of God's plan for humanity and His desire for His people to live in obedience to His commands. For Christians today, these texts remind us of the importance of living according to God's will and the eternal nature of His promises. Both Genesis and Jubilees are essential to understanding the full scope of God's plan for His people and His faithfulness to His covenant. If you have enjoyed learning about this and want to learn more about God's Word, check out our other videos here.